Team overview: who are her best, or her general best teammates in Nilou Bloom? Do you prefer Yaya, Barbara, Prototype Ember, Nahida, or Kokomi as the healer there? Prototype Ember, Nahida is not enough. Alright, let's get that out of the way right now. Don't play Prototype Ember, Nahida as your only healer. Please just don't. Prototype Ember, Nahida is not enough. Alright, let's get that out of the way right now. Don't play Prototype Ember, Nahida as your only healer. Please just don't. Please just don't. Please just don't.
Hey there. I don't know if you know this, but I'm the guy, when everyone was saying burning is a garbage reaction, decided to make it my life's mission to build a burning team. I'm the guy that 36-starred Abyss with a bunch of different non-bountiful core teams with a level 20 Nilou, because Genshin bros keep calling characters that have consistent off-field application trash because of their low personal damage, when it should be obvious by now when that isn't the point of those characters. When someone says X thing cannot do Y, I say we'll see about that. So when Zachef said don't play Prototype Amber Nahida as your only healer, it should be obvious what the next thing I said was. You're not my dad, I'll make it work. You'll see, I'm an adult. You can't tell me what to do anymore. But as it turns out, it's generally a good idea to listen to your parents, kids. This was going to be tough, but like a stubborn teenager, I was determined. Besides, this team is actually great for teaching a really important aspect of Genshin's elemental reaction system, known as elemental gauge theory. But to talk about that, we're going to have to sidetrack a bit to talk about amplifying reactions. You might already be aware that Vaporize and Melt deal different amounts of damage depending on which element triggers a reaction. The different versions of these reactions are referred to as forward and reverse. A forward Vapor Melt has a 2 times multiplier, and a reverse has 1.5 times. You may have wondered why Vape and Melt teams focus on reverse reactions when they have the lower multiplier, and the answer is actually pretty simple. You can just trigger more of them. Let me explain. Every reaction has 2 primary factors, the aura and the trigger. The aura is whatever element was applied to the enemy first. The trigger is the next element applied to the enemy after it has an aura. Important thing to note, it makes no difference whether or not the characters involved here are on or off field. The damage of the reaction is always based on the stats of the character that triggered the reaction. In a reverse reaction, less of the underlying aura is removed. So for instance, if you have Hydro on an enemy, you can normally apply Pyro to trigger a Vape, and that enemy will still have Hydro on them afterwards. That allows you to apply Pyro a second time for an additional Vape. However, a forward reaction steals away more of that aura. So if you have Pyro on an enemy and apply Hydro, normally, the Pyro will be removed, and the next time you apply Hydro, it won't trigger a second Vape, and will instead become an aura, causing your Pyro to become the trigger anyway. So what does this have to do with Nilou Bloom? Everything. What many players don't realize is that amplifying reactions aren't the only reactions that have this forward-reverse mechanic. The difference is, the reaction multiplier doesn't change for transformative reactions, meaning your 2 times Bloom multiplier is the same whether or not you go Dendro on Hydro or Hydro on Dendro. But going Hydro on Dendro means you'll trigger more Blooms. So really, there's even more of an incentive to try to make your Hydro units the trigger in Nilou teams. If you're willing to take the lower damage multiplier for reverse Vapes, you should definitely be able to see the value in the fact that you can do the same thing in Nilou teams without suffering that lower multiplier. That's where the no healer Nilou team comes in. It's notoriously difficult to control who is triggering Blooms in Nilou teams. In this team, that's not really a problem at all. You simply tag enemies with Nahida's skill, use Nilou's skill, run through enemies with Yelan's skill, and throw in the occasional breakthrough barb. That's right, ideally you don't even burst with Yelan in this team because the Hydro application would be too fast. Not only does this allow you to avoid taking self-damage from the Blooms, but it enables perfect control over the ownership of the Bloom. Played correctly, the only units triggering Blooms are Yelan and Nilou, our Hydro units. The ideal scenario we just covered. the self-damage isn't even an issue. We don't really even need Prototype Amber in most cases. So, what is the issue? Honestly, it's just skill issue. That's not to be toxic, it's just this team requires a deeper knowledge of the game than most, and it doesn't really have a set rotation. There's definitely an ideal rotation, but it's not perfect. Depending on how many enemies there are, how spaced out they are, and new enemies spawning, it's inevitable that adjustments will have to be made on the fly because of how Nahida's skill works. Remember, when we were talking about elemental gauge, well, one neat thing about Nahida's skill is that it applies more gauge than most other units. Whereas we can get 2 blooms off of Traveler's skill as an aura, we can technically get 3 off Nahida's. The thing is, if we remove too much too quickly after it's triggered, it won't trigger again, and we'll end up with Hydro on the enemy. If we end up with Hydro on the enemy, we're just applying more Hydro and not triggering any reactions, meaning Nahida's skill will never trigger and we'll never get blooms. See, a literal skill issue. In an ideal scenario, we have 3 to 4 enemies grouped up. Any less, and we start to run into problems re-triggering Nahida's skill. Another side note, Yelan's skill actually works to group enemies a tiny bit. It's not much, but hey, a common complaint is that you can't run a grouper in Nilou. I'm just saying that's technically incorrect. Anyway, in any other scenario besides the ideal one, we need to know how to fix things if we end up getting Hydro on the enemy. That's actually pretty simple. Swap to Nahida, do a normal attack and skill, or normal attack and charge attack if her skill is on cooldown. The normal attack will clear the Hydro, and the skill/charge attack will reapply Dendro as an aura. Simple enough in theory, but actually looking out for it instead of just trying to follow a flowchart and wondering why it's not working is easier said than done. That said, now would be a good time to talk about builds. Because we will inevitably trigger some blooms with Nahida because of skill issue, I have her on EM crit. Played perfectly, EM Dendro crit would still be better, but not by much. Triple EM is fine in this team if you aren't confident about controlling ownership of the reaction with your Hydra units. I'm giving her Prototype Amber 1 because I was told not to, but also 2, you can't dodge when you're using Yelan's skill, and 3, I have no way to clear the cryo field against the Kenkis, so I'll constantly be taking unavoidable damage from it. Just know it's not really even necessary for this team to function. Nilou is on 2-piece HP, triple HP. She's going to be triggering about a third of our blooms, so it's also important to make sure she gets some EM through substats. I've also given her Iron Sting for additional EM, but Key would be leagues better. If you have Key, Gilded or Flowers of Paradise Lost, still triple HP, will likely be the better option because it's actually pretty likely you'll overcap on HP with 2-piece, and Key. Kale doesn't even really need to be here, but she has EM share, so giving her instructors with an ER Sands and Fav can really boost EM in the team and help make sure she can cast her burst off cooldown to keep the EM boost active as often as possible. You could also go Elegy here if you have it, I don't. It also gives us a nice EM buff from Dendro Resonance. Yelan is on 4-piece triple EM Gilded Dreams with Stringless. I tried to get triple EM Flowers of Paradise Lost set for her here because rather than getting 150 EM from Gilded's 4-piece set bonus, she's only going to get 114% useless attack. Flop is normally 6-ish% better than Gilded in Bloom-based teams, and that just makes the gap wider. Not to mention, unlike Burgeon and Hyper Bloom, Blooms are literally the only reaction this team triggers, so there's no other reactions benefiting from the extra EM from Gilded. Unfortunately, I just couldn't get a single Goblet or Circlet to drop. Real quick, before we head into Abyss, I want to make it perfectly clear that my goal here isn't to say you should play Nilou Bloom without a healer. It will undoubtedly be better if you use a healer or shielder. The main reason I'm doing this is, yes, to show it can be done, but more so because this is a great team for showing off mechanics that are often misunderstood, and the higher skill floor for the team makes it very satisfying to play. Now, without further ado, let's head into Abyss. Alright, so I took way too long getting this video made, and Kirara is about to come out and make this challenge just absolutely not a challenge. So to get it out before then, like we have less than 24 hours before she drops, I'm just going to watch this and give a live commentary about what's happening with it here. Floors 9 through 11 were actually pretty easy. I ended up having to reset on floor 11 because I kind of screwed the pooch on something. It's not that big of a deal. But there is an ideal rotation. This is something I mentioned earlier. The ideal rotation is you want to skill and burst, tag all the enemies with Nahida, then use Nilou's skill, then Kale's burst, and then run through all of the enemies with Yelan. Then, on your second rotation, you skill and burst with Nahida again, then you burst with Nilou, use her skill, skill into skill, Kale burst again if it's up. You can do a skill with Kale if you need to. It's not really necessary. It's just a little extra EM. And then run through enemies with Yelan again, and use a breakthrough barb on the second rotation. So on the second rotation, the difference is you may not Kale burst, and you do Nilou burst, and you use a breakthrough barb with Yelan. It's pretty consistent for the most part if there's 3 or more enemies, but whenever there's less, you can run into some major problems. Floors 9 through 10 aren't really that big of an issue. Sometimes I will mess up with Nilou and do a third normal attack, which will make it to where I don't have the Hydro Aura. In most cases with Nilou teams, it's actually better to get, if you want control over your Hydro unit being your trigger, besides Nilou, to not do the E into E. It's better to just do E in 3, because then you won't have the Hydro Aura and only that other Hydro unit will be triggering reactions. But as I mentioned earlier, Nilou in this team is triggering about a third of our blooms. They're not doing nearly as much damage as the Yelan blooms. However, it is a substantial amount of the damage that we can't really afford to miss out on. We won't have the DPS to clear if we don't have Nilou's Hydro Aura here. One thing to note about floors 9 through 11, they're very similar. It felt like I was replaying the same chamber most times.
Gotcha.
Another thing to note with the Kairagi, an issue I kept running into was it seemed like I was going to kill them both at the same time. It's actually really, really, really important to kill them both at the same time here, because especially if the fire Kairagi is left alive and is able to get his health back, he self-infuses with pyro, and we'll see that a little later on. It'll become a bit of a big problem. This is a chamber where we're going to see one of those little bitty micro adjustments we have to do. You see we have the Pyro Gunner left over here, and he's going to get a shield. Well, it'll be a little bit too slow to try to actually trigger blooms on him. So we need to prioritize getting rid of the shield, which is why we bursted with Yelan there. This chamber is pretty simple. I tried the iframe with Nahida's burst, and it didn't happen. Yeah, as you can see, like things work out pretty well whenever you follow the basic rotation, but like whenever there's stuff like this, we have one guy left, we can end up having Hydro on him pretty easily, which is why I'm just trying to pick him off with Nahida there to avoid that. Here you see we got 2 enemies, and they're also Electro infused, which can cause some problems. And they do not like to stay grouped. It probably would have been better to actually Yelan burst here, but I was being stubborn at this point. It's only floor 11, so it's not that big of a deal. Here we ran into a bit of a problem. The best thing about this team is that you can outrun the blooms. However, these guys kind of sandwiched me, and I ended up taking the brunt of all the blooms. And it was not fun, but they also got kind of messed up from it. So it ended up working out. But yeah, Yelan got absolutely wrecked there. Once again, we have 2 enemies. That makes things a little bit more difficult to maintain Dendro on the enemy, especially whenever they like to be spread out like that.
What a drag.
but it's simple enough. We just have to make sure we stagger our application. Yeah, Kale also, she's got 250 ER, and technically that's not enough to burst without her skill, even in this team. So we're really only using her burst every other rotation. I did end up having to replay this because the Fire Kairagi ended up being left alive and got his shield back, and I just, you know, took too much damage before I realized I wasn't generating blooms on him. It happened again here, but I kind of realized what was up. And yeah, this chamber is actually pretty funny because I'm like, how did this dude not die? So I go through it and I'm like, I assumed that skill would finish him off, but it didn't. And you'd think I would learn from that, but it's going to happen again. I'm going to be like, oh, this dude is definitely dead, and then just leave him with just a tiny bit of help.
Why are you
Like,
still alive?
you hear me back there. Like, how are you still alive?
Do that.
And these guys, this is probably the easiest team I've ever used against these guys. I'm not gonna lie. Like, they really like to group up. We don't have a shield, so we don't have to worry about them getting shields. And, like, there's no rock floor trying to kill us. For once. Almost every time these guys show up in Abyss, there's a rock floor. And it's so annoying. Yeah, I'm not sure that axe attack is even dodgeable, by the way. I have spent some time trying to do it. I don't think that axe attack is dodgeable. There we go, 9 through 11. Yeah, so we're going to start off, we're going to actually Nilou burst in the first rotation here because the flying one, we need to knock it down. If we don't knock it down, we will not be able to clear in time. So we have to adjust our rotation and do Nilou's burst here. Yeah, one of the reasons why we like the Nilou burst in the second rotation is because Nilou's cooldown often will not be back up by the time you get to the second rotation, and doing her burst allows you to kill some time and make the rotation line up a little better. Since there's two enemies here, it would have technically been better to burst with Yelan and on-field Yelan for a bit, or on-field Nahida. It probably would have been better to on-field Nahida. But they are so aggressive, it would have been impossible to avoid taking the self-damage from the blooms. Which is the whole reason why we're playing this team, is to avoid taking the self-damage from the blooms. So we just had to hope that they lined up. Yeah, now would be a good time to mention, last time I did show both sides of floor 12. It took me 3 days. It took me 3 days to do this challenge. I did manage to clear the first chamber on day 1, but I ended up having to come back to do it. Yeah, so it would just be way too long of a video, and like it took me long enough to get this version of the video ready. Yeah, there's no way I'm showing both sides.
Yeah! There we go.
Yeah. Yeah, it was dirty. It's dirty. Yeah, we settled on deciding that I do actually have to burst with Yelan for this chamber. But that comes with its own problems, you know? Yeah, that was live me, and allow me to explain those problems. The first major problem is the self-damage. If we want to on-field Nahida and Yelan burst, we have to make sure we're standing far enough away from the blooms to avoid the damage. But it's really necessary here because this is effectively single target. You see, the way that the blooms work, let's say you have a bloom that does 50k damage. If there's one enemy, one bloom does 50k damage. But if there's 3 enemies, it's 50k damage to all 3 enemies, 150k. But there's 3 enemies, so really you're generating 3 blooms. So that's 150k 3 times. So whenever you have one enemy, you get the 50k, but you have 3 enemies, you get 450k. It's logarithmic. It's kind of insane. This is actually like one of my favorite teams to address this side because they like to CC the crap out of you. And it's like, nah, I'm just gonna run away with Yelan. We're good. But yeah, anyways, so when you're in single target, you have to use Yelan's burst in this team, and that's one of the micro adjustments you have to make. And whenever we have those hill trolls that want to stand really far away from each other, if we were to chase them down, it's one bloom to one enemy. It's effectively single target, even though there's more than one enemy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we just have to burst with Yelan. I think that's the only solution. Yeah, and it's the same thing here. The Kenkis don't always groove up, so we have to essentially pretend that this is single target and try to stand far enough to avoid the self-damage from the blooms with Nahida, and also try to dodge. But as you can see here, we're taking a lot of damage from that floor, which is really the only reason why we even need Prototype Amber in this team, is because that damage is kind of unavoidable. We have to be up in their face to get blooms, and to be up in their face, we have to be in the cryo field. One other thing. With Yelan's skill, we can't dodge while we're doing the skill, and if we're not doing the skill, we're not getting any blooms, so we're not getting any damage. So we just have to take the big AoE attacks, and it kind of sucks. And as you can see here, Nilou almost died, and it's about to get even worse.
She managed not to die. We're almost there.
What are the...
Alright, Nilou, you're our only form of Hydra application for a minute.
Make yourselves at home.
You can do this. I believe in you.
Just like we rehearsed.
I believe in you. Come on. Alright, call in Nilou. 30 seconds. You can do it.
All eyes on me. Positions.
We did it! With Yelan and Nahida dead. Oh, shit. Oh, damn. Thank God. It's over. We done it. Oh, I know how to do this. Look. We're going up, and then we're just going to...
Everyone hold hands.
Yeah.